The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet, winding road. James, a wealthy and successful businessman, was driving back from a weekend retreat in the countryside. The road ahead stretched empty for miles, bordered by dense woods on one side and open fields on the other. As he navigated a sharp curve, something unusual caught his eye, a small figure standing alone at the edge of the road. He slowed the car, his curiosity piqued. As he drew closer, he realized it was a young girl, no older than 6 or 7, with wide, frightened eyes. Her clothes were dusty, her face streaked with tears, and she was clutching a worn-out teddy bear tightly against her chest. James pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding with a mix of concern and unease. He got out of the car, approaching her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey there," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The girl looked up at him, her lip trembling. I got lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was trying to find my way home, but I don't know where it is." James felt a pang of sympathy. He couldn't imagine what this little girl must be feeling, alone and scared in the middle of nowhere. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he assured her. "We'll find your way home together. Okay. Do you know where you live?" She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "It's a small house with a red door, and my mommy is sick. She's waiting for me." James felt his heart clench at the mention of her sick mother. He knew what it was like to feel helpless, to watch someone you care about suffer. "Let's get you home, then," he said, standing up and offering his hand. "I'll take you there." The girl hesitated for a moment, then slipped her tiny hand into his. It was cold to the touch, and he gave it a reassuring squeeze. He opened the passenger door of his sleek, black car and helped her in, making sure she was safely buckled up before getting back into the driver's seat. As they drove, the girl sat quietly, staring out the window with her teddy bear still clutched in her arms. James glanced over at her occasionally, wondering what her story was, how she had ended up alone on that road. But he didn't press her with questions. He knew she needed to feel safe first. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke up. "What's your name?" "James," he replied with a small smile. "And what's yours?" "Emily," she said, her voice a bit stronger now. "Emily, that's a beautiful name," James said. He noticed a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. Encouraged, he continued, "How did you get lost, Emily? Were you out playing?" She nodded. "I wanted to pick some flowers for my mommy. She loves flowers. But then I couldn't find my way back." James's heart softened further. "You must love your mommy very much." Emily looked up at him, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "She's all I have," she whispered. "I don't want her to be alone." James felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't imagine what it would be like for a child to carry such a burden. "We're going to get you back to her. I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, Emily pointed out a narrow dirt path leading off the main road. "It's down there," she said. James turned onto the path, which led through a small wooded area before opening up to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a modest, weather-worn house with a bright red door, just as Emily had described. He parked the car and looked over at her. "Is this it?" Emily nodded, her face lighting up with relief. "Yes, this is home." James felt a wave of relief wash over him too, but it was tinged with a sense of foreboding. The house looked quiet, almost too quiet, and he wondered what kind of condition her mother might be in. They got out of the car, and Emily took off running toward the house, her small feet kicking up dust as she went. James followed at a slower pace, giving her space to reunite with her mother. As she reached the door, she paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, as if she were afraid of what she might find inside. James caught up to her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you want me to go in with you?" he asked. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. She nodded. James took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of illness and age. They stepped inside, and Emily immediately called out, "Mommy, I'm home." From one of the back rooms, there was a faint sound of movement, followed by a weak voice. "Emily, is that you?" Emily's face broke into a wide smile, and she ran towards the voice. James followed, his heart heavy with anticipation. When they reached the bedroom, he saw a frail woman lying in bed, her skin pale and her eyes sunken. But the moment she saw Emily, her entire face softened, and a small, weary smile appeared on her lips. "Mommy!" Emily cried, rushing to her side. The woman opened her arms weakly, and Emily climbed into bed with her, hugging her tightly. James stood in the doorway, watching the reunion with a lump in his throat. He knew then that this was more than just a simple act of kindness. This was fate bringing him to this moment, to this family. As he stood there, feeling like an intruder in their intimate moment, the woman looked up at him. Her eyes, though tired, were filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, unable to find the right words. He knew he had done something good today, something important. But as he watched Emily cuddle up to her mother, he also knew that his involvement in their lives had only just begun. As James stood in the doorway, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene in front of him. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with a single bed where Emily now lay wrapped in her mother's frail embrace. The air was thick with emotion, and James felt like he was intruding on something sacred. Yet, something kept him rooted to the spot, a sense that he needed to be there, that this moment was more significant than he could fully grasp. The woman's labored breathing filled the silence, her arms trembling as she held her daughter close. Emily clung to her mother, burying her face in the crook of her neck, as if she were trying to absorb every ounce of warmth and comfort she could. For a long moment, they simply held each other, the outside world forgotten. Then, the woman's eyes met James's again. This time, there was more than gratitude in them. There was a quiet plea, a silent acknowledgement that she needed help, that Emily needed help. James felt the weight of that gaze settle over him like a heavy mantle, and he stepped further into the room, his mind racing with the implications of what he was feeling. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper, "sit with us." James hesitated for a second, then pulled a wooden chair closer to the bed. He sat down slowly, his gaze flicking between the mother and daughter. He didn't know what to say, how to express the flood of emotions coursing through him. "I'm James," he finally said, his voice gentle, trying to find a way to start. "I'm glad I found Emily when I did. She's a brave little girl." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes clouding with exhaustion. "She's my world," she murmured, brushing a hand through Emily's hair. "I've tried to be strong for her, but I'm afraid I'm not strong enough." James felt a pang of sorrow. He knew all too well what it was like to carry burdens too heavy to bear alone. "You've done more than anyone could ask," he said softly. "You've raised a wonderful daughter." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Is my mommy going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. James's heart clenched. He wasn't sure how to answer. He looked at the woman, whose eyes were filled with a desperate kind of hope, as if she were holding on for her daughter's sake. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease Emily's fear, but the truth was a heavy burden on his tongue. "We're going to do everything we can to make sure she's okay," James finally said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm here to help." The woman's hand slipped from Emily's hair, falling weakly to her side. Her breath was shallow, and James could see how much effort it took for her to stay present in the moment. "I don't have much time," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her words. "I need to know that she'll be safe." James leaned forward, the gravity of the situation settling deep into his bones. "I'll make sure of it," he vowed, his voice firm. "Emily will be taken care of." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she seemed to relax, as if the promise had lifted a heavy burden from her heart. "Thank you," she breathed, her words full of gratitude and relief. "You're a good man, James." James looked at Emily, who was watching him with those wide, trusting eyes. In that instant, he knew that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't expected. He had come here as a stranger, but now he was part of something much bigger than himself. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the woman's labored breathing. Emily nestled closer to her mother, clinging to the comfort of her presence. James could see the exhaustion in the woman's eyes, the way her body was struggling to hold on. "Is there anything you need?" James asked softly, desperate to do something, anything, to ease her suffering. The woman shook her head slightly, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before she forced them open again. "Just stay with us," she whispered. "I don't want to be alone." James nodded, feeling the weight of her request settle over him. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, watching as the woman's breathing grew more labored, her strength fading with each passing moment. Emily fell asleep beside her, her tiny body curled up protectively against her mother's side. As the night wore on, the woman's breaths became shallower, more erratic. James could see the end approaching, and his heart ached for Emily, for the loss she was about to endure. He reached out and took the woman's hand, holding it gently, offering her what little comfort he could. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for being here." James squeezed her hand, his throat tight with emotion. "It's an honor," he replied, his voice thick. "I'll take care of her, I promise." The woman gave him one last, grateful smile before her eyes closed for the final time. Her chest rose and fell one last time, and then she was gone. James sat there in the silence, the reality of the situation sinking in. He looked at Emily, still asleep, unaware that her world had just changed forever. He knew he had to be strong for her, to guide her through the pain that was coming. But for now, he just sat there, holding the woman's hand, honoring the promise he had made. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, James finally let go of the woman's hand. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to wake Emily just yet. He knew that the hardest part was still ahead, the moment when Emily would wake up and realize her mother was gone. James took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had never imagined that his life would take such a turn, but now, there was no turning back. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. With one last look at the peaceful expression on the woman's face, James turned and walked out of the room. The world outside was beginning to wake up, the sun casting its first rays of light across the landscape. But for James, the day had already begun with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He would be there for Emily, no matter what, and he would honor the memory of the woman who had trusted him with the most precious thing in her life. James gently closed the door behind him, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily on his shoulders. The house was eerily quiet now, the only sound the soft ticking of an old clock somewhere in the distance. He stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts, but the reality of the situation pressed down on him like a vice. Emily was still asleep in the bedroom, blissfully unaware of the heartbreaking truth that awaited her. James knew he couldn't let her wake up alone to find her mother gone. But he also knew that there was no easy way to break the news to a child. He had to be careful, gentle, yet honest. The thought of it made his chest tighten with dread. He walked to the small living room, which was sparsely furnished with mismatched pieces that spoke of a life lived with little, but made the most of. The faded floral couch, the worn armchair, the threadbare rug. They all seemed to tell a story of resilience and quiet determination. James sank into the armchair, running a hand through his hair as he tried to figure out how to handle the situation. But the longer he sat there, the more he realized that nothing could have prepared him for this moment. All his wealth, all his success in the business world, none of it mattered here. This was about something far more profound, something that required a kind of strength he wasn't sure he possessed. Yet, as he thought about the promise he had made to Emily's mother, he knew he couldn't fail her. He wouldn't fail her. James was still lost in thought when a soft noise reached his ears, the sound of small footsteps shuffling down the hallway. His heart skipped a beat as he looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, her teddy bear dangling from one hand. She looked so fragile, so small in the dim morning light that filtered through the curtains. "Mr. James," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Is Mommy okay?" James felt a lump rise in his throat. He stood up slowly, every step toward her feeling like a battle against the crushing weight of what he had to do. When he reached her, he knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, and gently took her free hand in his. "Emily," he began, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "I need to tell you something very important." Emily's big, innocent eyes locked onto his, and he could see the trust there, the unspoken belief that he would make everything right. It made what he had to say even harder. He took a deep breath, squeezing her hand a little tighter. "Your mommy, she was very sick," he said softly, his words deliberate, careful. "She loved you so much, Emily, and she fought very hard to stay with you. But sometimes when people are very sick, they have to go to a special place where they can rest. Your mommy, she's gone to that place now." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment, James could see the confusion, the dawning realization, and then the devastating comprehension of what he was saying. Her small face crumpled, and tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over and running down her cheeks. "No, no," she whimpered, shaking her head as if trying to deny the truth. "She can't be gone. She can't leave me." James's heart shattered at the sight of her pain. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she sobbed against his chest. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he whispered, his own voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry." They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, Emily's small body racked with sobs, while James held her, offering what little comfort he could. He wished he could take away her pain, wished there was something he could do to make it all better, but he knew that all he could do now was be there for her, as he had promised. Eventually, Emily's sobs quieted, and she pulled back slightly, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. What am I going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anyone else." James felt a surge of protectiveness well up inside him. He cupped her cheek, brushing away the tears with his thumb. "You have me," he said firmly. "I promised your mommy I'd take care of you, and I'm going to keep that promise. You're not alone, Emily. I'm here for you, and I always will be." Emily sniffled, looking at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Really, James assured her. "We're going to figure this out together. You're not alone, I promise." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting his words as truth. But there was still a deep sadness in her eyes, a sadness that James knew wouldn't easily fade. He stood up, still holding her hand, and guided her back to the bedroom where her mother lay. They approached the bed together, and Emily climbed up, sitting beside her mother's still form. She looked so small, so vulnerable, as she reached out and touched her mother's hand one last time. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her grief. James felt tears sting his own eyes, but he blinked them back, knowing he had to be strong for Emily. "She loved you more than anything in the world," he said softly. "And she's always going to be with you, in your heart. You'll carry her love with you, wherever you go." Emily nodded, her tiny shoulders trembling. She leaned down and kissed her mother's forehead, a final farewell that broke James's heart all over again. Then, she climbed back down from the bed and turned to James, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. James knelt down again, taking both her hands in his. "Now we go home," he said gently. "My home, where you'll stay with me. We'll take it one day at a time, and I'll be there every step of the way. You're not alone, Emily. We'll get through this together." She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, then finally nodded. "Okay," she whispered. James wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond anything he had ever known. He had a new responsibility now, a new mission in life, and it was one he intended to fulfill with everything he had. As they left the house together, Emily's small hand firmly held in his, James looked up at the sky, the sun now fully risen, casting a golden light over the world. It was a new day, a new beginning, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew that they would find their way together. And as they walked away from the only home Emily had ever known, James silently promised himself, and her, that he would do everything in his power to make sure she never felt alone again. The drive back to James's estate was quiet, the silence filled with the unspoken grief that lingered between them. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her small hands clutching her teddy bear tightly, her eyes staring out the window, lost in a world of pain and confusion. James glanced at her periodically, his heart aching at the sight of her, so small and fragile in the face of such a profound loss. He wanted to say something to comfort her, to ease the heaviness that weighed down on both of them, but the words eluded him. As they approached the city, the landscape gradually shifted from rural roads to bustling streets lined with tall buildings and busy sidewalks. The change was jarring, a stark contrast to the quiet countryside where Emily had spent her entire life. James could see the apprehension in her eyes as the city loomed closer, the noise and the lights overwhelming her. "We're almost there," he said gently, trying to offer some reassurance. "It's a big place, but you'll get used to it. I'll be with you the whole time." Emily didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the world outside. James could only imagine what she was thinking, how lost she must feel, uprooted from everything she'd ever known and thrust into a completely new environment. He wished there was a way to make this easier for her, but he knew it would take time. Finally, they arrived at James's estate, a sprawling property nestled behind tall iron gates. As the gates swung open and they drove up the long, winding driveway, Emily's eyes widened in awe. The house was massive, with tall, white columns and expansive windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was a place of grandeur and luxury, a far cry from the modest home she had shared with her mother. James parked the car and turned to Emily, who was staring up at the house with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "This is your new home," he said softly. "I know it's different, but I hope you'll come to feel comfortable here." Emily didn't say anything, but she nodded slightly, her expression guarded. James got out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door and offering her his hand. She took it hesitantly, her small fingers gripping his tightly as they walked toward the house together. The front door opened before they reached it, and James's housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, stepped out to greet them. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, and she immediately knelt down to Emily's level. "Hello, sweetheart," Mrs. Thompson said gently. "My name is Mrs. Thompson, but you can call me Mary. We've been expecting you." Emily looked at her uncertainly, then glanced up at James, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It's okay," he said softly. "Mary's here to help take care of us." Mrs. Thompson reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from Emily's face. "We're going to make sure you're comfortable here," she said kindly. "And if there's anything you need, anything at all, you just let me know, all right?" Emily nodded again, her grip on James's hand tightening. "Okay," she whispered. "Why don't we go inside and get you settled?" James suggested, trying to keep his tone light. "I'll show you your room, and then we can have some dinner. How does that sound?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes still shadowed with uncertainty, but she nodded once more. James gave her hand a gentle squeeze and led her inside, with Mrs. Thompson following closely behind. The interior of the house was just as grand as the exterior. High ceilings, polished floors, and elegant furnishings that spoke of wealth and taste. But to Emily, it must have seemed cold and unfamiliar, a far cry from the warmth of her old home. She stayed close to James as they walked through the grand foyer and up the sweeping staircase to the second floor. James led her down a long hallway to a room at the end, opening the door to reveal a beautifully decorated bedroom. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and the bed was covered with a quilt of pastel colors. There was a small desk by the window, and shelves filled with books and toys, all carefully chosen with a child's comfort in mind. "This is your room," James said, watching her closely for any sign of how she was feeling. "I hope you like it. If there's anything you want to change, just let me know." Emily stepped into the room, her eyes wide as she took in her new surroundings. She walked slowly over to the bed, her fingers trailing over the quilt, then looked at the books on the shelf. Finally, she turned to James, her expression unreadable. "It's nice," she said quietly, though there was no real enthusiasm in her voice. James felt a pang of guilt. He had wanted to make her feel welcome, to give her a space that felt like her own, but he knew that no amount of comfort could replace what she had lost. Still, He was determined to do whatever he could to help her feel at home. "I'm glad you think so," he said, forcing a smile. "Why don't you take some time to explore your room? I'll be downstairs if you need anything." Emily nodded, but she didn't move. She just stood there looking around the room as if trying to make sense of it all. James hesitated, unsure if he should stay or give her some space. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer more comfort, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. "I'll be right back," he said softly, deciding to give her a few moments alone. "Take your time." He turned to leave, but before he could step out of the room, he felt a small tug on his sleeve. He looked down to see Emily clutching the fabric of his jacket, her eyes wide with a silent plea. "Can you stay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. He knelt down beside her, his expression softening. "Of course I can," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily seemed to relax a little at his words, and she let go of his sleeve, taking a few tentative steps further into the room. James followed her lead, staying close but giving her space to explore. She wandered over to the bookshelf, her fingers brushing over the spines of the books. "Do you like to read?" James asked, trying to engage her in something familiar. Emily nodded, pulling a book off the shelf and looking at the cover. "Mommy used to read to me every night," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. She had a really nice voice. James swallowed hard, the weight of her loss hitting him once again. "Would you like me to read to you tonight?" he offered, hoping to bring her some comfort. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and hesitation. "Would you?" James smiled gently. "Of course. We can pick out any book you want, and I'll read it to you before bed." For the first time since they'd left her old home, Emily's face softened into a small, tentative smile. "Okay," she said quietly. James felt a surge of relief, knowing he had managed to bring her a small measure of comfort. "Why don't we pick out a book now, and then we can have some dinner? Does that sound good?" Emily nodded, and together, they chose a book from the shelf. James led her downstairs, where Mrs. Thompson had prepared a simple but delicious meal. They ate together in the dining room, the silence between them comfortable, even though it was tinged with sadness. After dinner, James and Emily returned to her room, where she changed into the pajamas that Mrs. Thompson had laid out for her. James sat on the edge of her bed, the book they had chosen resting in his lap. "Are you ready for your story?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. "I'm ready," she said softly. James opened the book and began to read, his voice steady and calm as he brought the story to life. Emily listened intently, her eyes growing heavy as the words washed over her. By the time he finished the first chapter, she was fast asleep, her breathing slow and even. James closed the book quietly, placing it on the nightstand. He looked down at Emily, her face peaceful in sleep, and felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. This little girl had lost so much, and it was now up to him to make sure she felt safe, loved, and cared for. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Emily," he whispered. "I'll always be here for you." As he stood up and turned off the light, James knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in both of their lives. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. He had made a promise to Emily's mother, and he intended to keep it with all his heart. The first rays of morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across Emily's new room. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that accompanies the early hours before the world fully awakens. James stood in the hallway, just outside Emily's door, hesitating for a moment before he gently knocked. "Emily," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. When there was no response, he slowly opened the door and peeked inside. Emily was still asleep, curled up under the covers with her teddy bear tucked close to her chest. Her face was peaceful, her dark hair fanned out across the pillow. James felt a wave of tenderness wash over him as he watched her, this little girl who had been through so much already. He knew that today would be a significant step in their new life together, and he wanted to make it as easy as possible for her. Stepping quietly into the room, James approached the bed and gently touched her shoulder. "Emily," he whispered, "it's time to wake up, sweetheart." Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she blinked sleepily at him. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, as if trying to remember where she was. But then recognition dawned in her eyes, and she gave him a small, sleepy smile. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice still heavy with sleep. "Good morning," James replied, his own smile soft and reassuring. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," Emily said, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "It's a big bed." James chuckled softly. "It is, isn't it? I'm glad you slept well. Are you hungry? Mrs. Thompson is making breakfast downstairs." Emily nodded, her smile growing a little more confident. "Can I have pancakes?" "Absolutely," James said, relieved to see a hint of enthusiasm in her voice. "Let's go downstairs and see what Mary's whipped up for us." Emily climbed out of bed, her small feet padding across the floor as she followed James down the hallway and the grand staircase. The house felt different in the morning light, less imposing, more welcoming. James hoped that, in time, Emily would come to feel at home here. When they reached the kitchen, Mrs. Thompson greeted them with a warm smile. The scent of pancakes filled the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The kitchen, with its large windows overlooking the garden, was filled with sunlight, making the space feel cozy and inviting. "Good morning, Emily," Mrs. Thompson said cheerfully. "I've made your favorite, pancakes with maple syrup. Does that sound good?" Emily's face lit up a little, and she nodded. "Yes, please," she said quietly, slipping into a chair at the breakfast table. James watched as Mrs. Thompson placed a plate of pancakes in front of Emily, the sight of the familiar breakfast seeming to bring her a small measure of comfort. He took a seat across from her, grateful for Mrs. Thompson's gentle presence and the way she seemed to know exactly what Emily needed. As they ate, James kept the conversation light, asking Emily about her favorite things, books, games, colors, anything to keep her mind occupied and help her feel more at ease. Emily answered in short, soft-spoken sentences, but James noticed that she was beginning to relax, her posture less tense, her eyes less guarded. After breakfast, James suggested they explore the house together. He wanted Emily to feel comfortable in her new surroundings, to know that this was her home now too. They wandered through the different rooms, from the grand library filled with shelves of books to the sunroom with its bright, airy feel and view of the garden. "Do you like to garden?" James asked as they passed through the sunroom, hoping to spark her interest. Emily shrugged slightly. "I used to help Mommy with the flowers sometimes," she said quietly. She liked roses. James smiled gently. "Roses are beautiful. We have a garden outside with lots of different flowers. Maybe we can plant some roses together. Would you like that?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his as if trying to decide whether she could trust him with such a precious memory. After a moment, she nodded. "I think I would." "Great," James said, feeling a small surge of hope. "We can pick out the prettiest ones and plant them right by the window, so you can see them every day." They continued their tour, and as they walked through the house, James noticed that Emily seemed more curious, asking questions about the different rooms and even smiling once or twice at his explanations. It was a small but encouraging sign that she was starting to feel more comfortable. Eventually, they reached a room at the far end of the house, one that James had deliberately saved for last. He opened the door to reveal a large, bright space filled with toys, games, and art supplies. The room was designed with children in mind, a place where Emily could play, create, and let her imagination run wild. "This is your playroom," James said, watching her reaction carefully. "You can come here anytime you want. There are lots of things to do, puzzles, dolls, books, and even some art supplies if you like to draw." Emily stepped into the room, her eyes widening as she took in the array of toys and activities. She walked over to a small table covered in colored pencils and drawing paper, her fingers brushing over the supplies. "Do you like to draw?" James asked, his tone gentle. Emily nodded, picking up a pencil and tracing it over the paper. "Mommy always said I was good at drawing," she said softly, a hint of pride in her voice. "I'm sure you are," James said with a smile. "Maybe you can draw something for me later. I'd love to see your artwork." Emily smiled shyly, still holding the pencil. "Okay," she agreed. James watched her for a moment, then decided to give her some space. "I'll let you explore," he said, standing up. "If you need anything, I'll be right down the hall." Emily looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Are you leaving?" James shook his head quickly. "No, I'm not leaving. I'm just going to be in the other room, but I'll be right here if you need me." She seemed reassured by that, and she nodded, turning her attention back to the drawing paper. James quietly left the room, but he kept the door ajar, listening for any sign that she needed him. As he sat down in the nearby study, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Emily was slowly beginning to adjust, but James knew the road ahead would be long. There would be days filled with grief, confusion, and fear, but there would also be moments of joy, growth, and healing. He was determined to be there for all of it, to guide her through this new chapter in her life with as much love and patience as he could muster. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard the faint sound of pencil strokes from the playroom. He smiled to himself, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had taken the first steps together, and though the journey would be difficult, he was ready to face it head-on. For Emily, for the promise he had made, and for the life they were beginning to build together. And so, as the morning sunlight filled the house with warmth and light, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning filled with hope. Hope for healing, hope for love, and hope for the future that lay ahead. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act for James. He was determined to give Emily the stability she needed while also respecting the grief she was still processing. Each morning, they fell into a quiet routine. Breakfast together, followed by small activities around the house, like exploring the garden or reading in the sunroom. James made sure to be present, always offering a gentle hand when Emily seemed lost or overwhelmed, but also allowing her space to express her emotions in her own time. As the days passed, James noticed subtle changes in Emily. She smiled more often, asked more questions, and even began to venture into the playroom on her own. But there were still moments when the weight of her loss would press down on her, when she would retreat into herself, clutching her teddy bear and staring off into the distance. During those times, James would sit quietly by her side, offering silent support until she was ready to come back to him. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as they were sitting in the garden, that Emily suddenly looked up at James with a question that seemed to have been brewing in her mind for some time. "Mr. James," she began hesitantly, her voice soft but filled with a seriousness that caught his attention. "Do you think Mommy is watching over me?" James paused, taken aback by the depth of the question. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the need for reassurance. He reached over, taking her small hand in his, and thought carefully before he spoke. "I do, Emily," he said gently. "I believe that your mommy loved you so much that she'll always be with you in some way. Maybe you won't see her, but you'll feel her in your heart, in the memories you have, and in the love she gave you." Emily looked down at their joined hands, her brow furrowed in thought. "Sometimes, when I'm really sad, I think I can feel her, like she's hugging me. But then I remember she's gone, and it makes me sadder." James felt a pang of sympathy and squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay to feel sad," he said softly. "It's okay to miss her and wish she was still here. But just because she's not with us in the same way, it doesn't mean she's not still a part of your life. That feeling you get, it's her love, and it's something that will never go away." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned into James, resting her head against his arm. "I miss her so much," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I know, sweetheart," he murmured. "I know." For a long time, they sat like that, the garden quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. James felt the weight of Emily's sorrow as if it were his own, and he wished there was something more he could do to take it away. But he knew that grief was a process, one that Emily had to go through in her own time. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, James felt Emily's grip on him tighten. He looked down to see her staring at something across the yard, her expression suddenly alert. "What is it, Emily?" he asked, following her gaze. Emily pointed toward the far end of the garden, where a cluster of rose bushes bloomed in full color. "Those roses," she said quietly. They're like the ones Mommy had at our old house. She used to say they were her favorite. James's heart swelled with a mix of sorrow and hope. Would you like to pick some? He asked, sensing that this might be a way to help Emily feel connected to her mother. Emily nodded, her eyes never leaving the roses. James stood, holding out his hand to her. Together, they walked across the garden to the rose bushes, the scent of the flowers filling the air as they approached. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing over the soft petals of a pale pink rose. Mommy always said that roses are like people, she said softly, more to herself than to James. They're beautiful, but they have thorns. You have to be careful when you hold them. James crouched down beside her, listening intently. That's a wise thought, he said gently. Your mommy was right. Roses are strong, but delicate, just like the love we have for the people we care about. Emily carefully picked the rose, cradling it in her hands as if it were something precious. She looked up at James, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Can we keep it? She asked, her voice trembling. Of course, James replied, his own voice thick with emotion. We can put it in a vase and keep it somewhere special. They walked back to the house, Emily clutching the rose gently in her hands. Inside, James found a small crystal vase and filled it with water, placing the rose inside. Emily watched him closely, her expression serious. Where should we put it? She asked, looking around the room. James thought for a moment. How about in your room, by the window? That way, it'll catch the sunlight, and you can see it every day. Emily nodded, her face softening. That sounds nice. Together, they carried the vase upstairs to Emily's room. James placed it on the windowsill, adjusting it so the sunlight hit the rose just right. Emily stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the flower. Thank you, she whispered after a moment, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity. James turned to her, his heart full. You're welcome, Emily. That night, as James read to her before bed, he noticed a small change in Emily. She seemed calmer, more at peace, as if the simple act of bringing the rose into the house had given her a sense of connection to her mother that she desperately needed. It was a small step, but it was a step toward healing, and James felt a glimmer of hope that they were moving in the right direction. As he finished the story and tucked Emily in, she looked up at him, her eyes bright in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Mr. James? She asked, her voice steady. Yes, Emily? Do you think we could plant more roses in the garden? Like the ones Mommy had? James smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love for this brave little girl. I think that's a wonderful idea, he said. We'll plant a whole garden full of roses, just like your mommy's. Emily's face lit up with a small, genuine smile, the first James had seen in a while. I'd like that, she said softly. I think Mommy would like that too. James leaned down and kissed her forehead. Then it's settled, he said gently. We'll make it happen. As he turned off the light and left her room, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more difficult days to come, but they had taken another step forward. They were building something new, something beautiful, out of the love and memories that Emily's mother had left behind. And in that moment, James knew that they would be okay. They had faith, they had hope, and most importantly, they had each other. And that was enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. As the days turned into weeks, James and Emily settled into a rhythm that felt more like a family. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories that hinted at a brighter future. Emily's laughter, once a rare sound, began to fill the house more frequently. She started to explore the estate with a curiosity that reminded James of her resilience and the strength she carried within her small frame. One warm afternoon, James decided it was time to start on the rose garden they had talked about. He knew how much it would mean to Emily, and he hoped it would be another step toward healing. Emily, James called softly from the doorway of her room, where she was quietly reading. Would you like to help me in the garden today? I thought we could start planting those roses you love. Emily looked up from her book, a spark of interest lighting up her eyes. Really? She asked, her voice tinged with excitement. James smiled and nodded. Really? We'll do it together, just like we talked about. Emily hopped off the bed, setting her book aside, and hurried to join him. They walked out to the garden together, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the flowers and trees. James had already prepared a section of the garden for their project, the soil freshly turned and ready for planting. "Here we are," James said, gesturing to the area they would work on. "This spot gets lots of sunlight, so the roses should do really well here." Emily knelt down beside the soil, her fingers lightly brushing over the earth. "It's perfect," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. James watched her for a moment, feeling a deep sense of pride and affection. "I'm glad you think so," he said gently. "We can plant as many roses as you like. This will be your garden." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "My garden?" James nodded. "Yes, your garden. You can take care of it, choose what to plant, and make it your own special place." Emily's face softened into a small but genuine smile. "Mommy would have liked that," she said quietly, a note of wistfulness in her voice. James's heart ached at the mention of her mother, but he saw the hope in Emily's eyes, the way she was beginning to see this garden as a way to keep her mother's memory alive. "She would have," he agreed softly, "and I think she'd be very proud of you for taking care of it." Together, they began the work of planting. James showed Emily how to dig the holes just deep enough, how to gently place the rose bushes into the soil, and how to pack the earth around them to keep them secure. Emily listened carefully, her focus intense as she worked. She seemed to find comfort in the process, in the way her hands connected with the earth, in the way she was creating something new out of the loss she had endured. As they worked side by side, James noticed how much more at ease Emily seemed, how the simple act of planting the roses was helping her feel more grounded. He realized that this garden was more than just a tribute to her mother. It was a way for Emily to find her own strength, to rebuild her sense of self in a world that had been turned upside down. The hours passed quickly as they planted, watered, and arranged the rose bushes in neat rows. By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. They stood back to admire their work, the newly planted roses catching the last light of the day. "It's beautiful," Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe as she took in the sight of the garden. "It's like a little piece of mommy is here with us." James felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, not wanting to show the depth of his own emotions. "It is," he said, his voice steady, "and every time you look at these roses, you'll remember her love. It'll be something beautiful that you and your mommy share." Emily turned to James, her eyes shining with tears, but they were tears of gratitude and love. "Thank you, Mr. James," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for everything." James knelt down beside her, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and affection. "You don't have to thank me, Emily," he said gently. "I'm just glad I can be here for you. We're in this together, okay? We're a team." Emily nodded, and then, to James's surprise, she wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. It was the first time she had initiated such a gesture, and it took James a moment to react. But when he did, he hugged her back just as tightly, feeling the warmth of her small body pressed against him, the trust and love she was beginning to place in him. As they embraced, James felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that they were both exactly where they were meant to be. The journey ahead would still have its challenges, but in that moment, he knew they had taken a significant step forward. The bond between them had strengthened, forged in the shared work of planting a garden that would bloom with love and memory. When they finally pulled apart, the sky had darkened, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle overhead. James stood, holding out his hand to Emily. "Let's go inside," he said softly. "We've earned a good dinner tonight." Emily took his hand, her smile small but full of contentment. "Can we check on the roses tomorrow?" she asked as they walked back to the house. "Of course," James replied with a smile. "We'll check on them every day if you want." "I'd like that," Emily said, her voice filled with quiet determination. As they entered the house, the warmth and light welcoming them in, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The garden was just the beginning, a symbol of the new life they were creating together. And as they sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was different, lighter, more filled with hope. James knew that they still had a long way to go, but they were moving forward one step at a time. And as long as they had each other, he was certain they could face whatever came next. Together, they would make this house a home. And in the process, they would find a way to heal, to grow, and to flourish, just like the roses they had planted that day. The weeks passed in a steady rhythm, and the garden they had planted began to bloom, filling the air with the sweet scent of roses. Emily's connection to the garden grew stronger each day, and it became a sanctuary for her, a place where she could feel close to her mother and find peace in the beauty of the flowers. James watched with quiet pride as she tended to the roses, her small hands becoming more skilled with each passing day. But even as the roses blossomed, James knew that the process of healing was not linear. There were still days when Emily would retreat into herself, days when the grief seemed too much to bear. And as the summer stretched on, the weather began to change, mirroring the turmoil that sometimes brewed inside her. One afternoon, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, James found Emily sitting in the garden, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the sky. The air was thick with the promise of a storm, the kind that rolled in suddenly, with fierce winds and heavy rain. James approached her slowly, sensing the tension in the air and in her small, still frame. "Emily," he called gently as he reached her side. "Are you okay?" She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "It feels like the world is angry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. James knelt down beside her, feeling the first drops of rain begin to fall. "Why do you say that?" he asked, his tone soft and full of concern. Emily finally turned to him, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut through him. "Because sometimes I feel like that too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Like I'm so mad and so sad all at once, and I don't know what to do with it." James's heart ached at her words, the raw honesty of her emotions. He reached out and gently took her hand. "It's okay to feel that way, Emily," he said softly. "It's okay to be angry and sad. You've been through so much, and those feelings are part of what you're going through." Emily squeezed his hand tightly, her small fingers digging into his palm. "But it's scary," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to feel like this. I don't want to be mad all the time." James pulled her into a gentle embrace, sheltering her from the now steady rain that began to fall around them. "I know it's scary," he murmured, his voice soothing, "but you're not alone in this. I'm here with you, and we'll get through it together." Emily buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back tears. "I miss her so much," she sobbed, the words muffled against him. "And I'm so mad that she's gone." James held her tighter, the rain soaking through his clothes as he rocked her gently, trying to absorb some of her pain. "I know, sweetheart," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "It's okay to be mad. It's okay to cry. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The storm above them intensified, the wind whipping through the trees, sending leaves and petals scattering across the garden. But James stayed with her, anchoring her in the midst of the chaos, until her sobs began to quiet and her grip on him loosened. As the rain poured down around them, washing away the dirt and dust, James felt a shift within himself. He had promised to be there for Emily, to guide her through her grief, but in that moment, he realized just how deeply he had come to care for her, how much she had become a part of his life, his heart. He gently pulled back, brushing the wet hair from her face. "Let's get inside," he said softly, his voice filled with tenderness. "We'll dry off and have some hot chocolate, okay?" Emily nodded, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a small spark of trust, of hope. She took his hand, and together they walked back to the house, their clothes dripping wet, but their bond stronger than ever. Inside, Mrs. Thompson greeted them with a warm towel and a concerned expression. "You two look like you've been caught in a monsoon," she exclaimed, wrapping the towel around Emily and then handing one to James. "We had a bit of an adventure," James replied with a small smile, ruffling Emily's hair as he dried it. "But we're okay." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I'll make some hot chocolate," she said, disappearing into the kitchen as James led Emily to the living room. They sat together on the couch, wrapped in blankets, as the storm raged outside. The rain pounded against the windows, the sound both soothing and relentless. James handed Emily a steaming mug of hot chocolate, the warmth radiating from the cup as she held it in her hands. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James smiled at her, a gentle, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me, Emily. I'm just glad you're here, that we're here together." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Reassurance, comfort, maybe even love. "Do you ever feel like this?" she asked suddenly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Like the storm is inside you?" James was silent for a moment, taken aback by the depth of her question. He had spent so much of his life building walls, keeping his emotions in check, that he had almost forgotten what it was like to feel so deeply, so openly. But Emily's question struck a chord in him, a reminder that he, too, had his own storms to weather. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly, his gaze steady on hers, "sometimes it feels like there's a lot inside me that I don't know how to handle. But I've learned that it's okay to feel that way, that it's okay to ask for help when you need it." Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe we can help each other," she said, her voice small but determined. James felt a surge of emotion at her words, a deep sense of connection and mutual understanding. "I think that's a great idea," he replied softly, his heart swelling with pride for this brave little girl who had already been through so much and was still willing to reach out, to trust. They sat together in the warm glow of the living room, the storm outside gradually losing its fury as the hours passed. The world outside the window seemed to calm, the rain slowing to a gentle patter, the wind dying down to a soft whisper. And within the walls of the house, a quiet peace settled over them, a sense that, no matter what storms came their way, they would face them together. As Emily drifted off to sleep, her head resting on James's shoulder, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life had taken him on an unexpected journey, one filled with challenges and heartbreak, but also with profound moments of connection and love. He had found a new purpose in caring for Emily, in helping her navigate the storms within her, and in the process, he had discovered parts of himself that he had long forgotten. The night wore on, and the storm finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, fresh and new. James carefully picked up the sleeping Emily and carried her upstairs to her bed, tucking her in with a tenderness that came from the deepest part of his heart. As he stood by her bed, watching her sleep, he knew that the journey they were on was far from over. There would be more storms, more moments of doubt and fear, but there would also be more moments like this, moments of quiet connection, of shared strength, of love that could weather any storm. And as he turned off the light and quietly closed the door, James felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead might be long and uncertain, but he wasn't walking it alone. He had Emily, and she had him. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and together, they would find a way to turn their storms into something beautiful. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the storm from the previous night, now a distant memory. The air was fresh and cool, the garden glistening with dew in the soft morning light. James woke early, his mind still lingering on the events of the night before. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's tear-streaked face, her small frame trembling with the force of her emotions. But he also couldn't forget the strength she had shown, the determination to confront her feelings rather than hide from them. After dressing, James made his way downstairs, hoping to catch a quiet moment before Emily woke up. He found Mrs. Thompson already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with her usual efficiency. She greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes full of the quiet wisdom that only comes with years of experience. "Good morning, James," she said, her voice kind. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," James replied, leaning against the counter as he watched her work. "Emily had a tough night, but I think we made some progress." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She's a strong girl," she said, her tone gentle. "But she's been through so much. It's good that she has you to help her through it." James felt a swell of emotion at her words, a mix of gratitude and responsibility. "I just want to do right by her," he said quietly. "She deserves so much more than what life has given her so far." "And you're giving her that," Mrs. Thompson said firmly, turning to face him with a reassuring smile. "Don't doubt yourself, James. You're exactly what she needs." Before James could respond, they both heard the sound of soft footsteps descending the stairs. Emily appeared in the doorway, her hair slightly tousled from sleep, but her eyes brighter than they had been the night before. "Good morning," she said shyly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good morning, Emily," James replied, his voice warm. "How did you sleep?" "Better," she said, nodding. "Thank you for last night." James smiled at her, feeling a deep sense of pride. "You're welcome, Emily. I'm glad you're feeling better." Mrs. Thompson placed a plate of pancakes on the table, the scent of maple syrup filling the room. "Come, sit down," she said, motioning for them to take their seats. "Breakfast is ready." They sat together at the table, the atmosphere light and easy as they shared the meal. Emily seemed more at ease, her usual quietness now accompanied by a willingness to engage, to talk about the small things that filled her day. James listened attentively, cherishing these moments of normalcy that felt so precious after everything they had been through. Just as they were finishing breakfast, there was a sudden knock at the door. The sound was unexpected, and both James and Mrs. Thompson exchanged curious glances. "I'll get it," James said, rising from the table. As he approached the front door, he felt a slight unease. They rarely had visitors, and he wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, he was met with the sight of a man in his late 50s, well-dressed but with an air of casual familiarity. The man's eyes were sharp, and there was a knowing smile on his lips. "James," the man greeted him, his tone warm yet measured. "It's been a while." James felt a jolt of surprise. He hadn't seen this man in years, not since his life had taken a very different turn. "Mr. Harrington," he replied, his voice guarded. "What brings you here?" Mr. Harrington, a longtime business associate of James's, raised an eyebrow at the formality. "Can an old friend drop by for a visit?" he asked, though his tone suggested there was more to his visit than simple socializing. James stepped back, opening the door wider to allow him in. "Of course," he said, though a part of him was still wary. "Come in." As Mr. Harrington entered the house, his eyes scanned the room with the keen observation of someone used to assessing situations quickly. When his gaze fell on Emily, who had come to stand in the doorway of the kitchen, his expression softened slightly. "And who is this young lady?" Mr. Harrington asked, his tone gentle as he addressed Emily. "This is Emily," James said, walking over to stand beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Emily, this is Mr. Harrington. He's an old friend." Emily looked up at Mr. Harrington with wide, curious eyes, but said nothing. She was clearly unsure of this new presence in the house, and James could sense her hesitation. "Nice to meet you, Emily," Mr. Harrington said with a smile. "You must be very special to be staying here with James." Emily didn't respond, just nodded slightly before stepping back into the kitchen, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. James watched her go, a protective instinct flaring up inside him. He turned back to Mr. Harrington, his expression carefully neutral. "What brings you here, really?" he asked, his voice low enough that Emily wouldn't hear. Mr. Harrington's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "I heard about what happened," he said, his tone now laced with concern. "And I wanted to see how you were doing. How you both were doing." James stiffened slightly, not sure how much Mr. Harrington knew or what he intended to do with that information. "We're managing," he said, his voice steady but distant. Mr. Harrington studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "James, I've known you for a long time," he said quietly. "I know you're a private person, but you don't have to go through this alone. If there's anything I can do to help." James's initial instinct was to push him away, to keep this part of his life separate from the world he had left behind. But as he looked at Mr. Harrington, he realized that the man's concern was genuine, and that maybe, just maybe, there was a way he could help. "We're okay for now," James said finally, his tone softening. "But, thank you. I appreciate the offer." Mr. Harrington nodded, accepting the response without pressing further. "If that changes," he said, "you know where to find me." James nodded in return, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. As much as he wanted to protect the life he was building with Emily, he knew that there were parts of his past that couldn't be entirely shut out. And maybe, just maybe, opening up a little wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. As they moved to sit in the living room, Emily reappeared in the doorway, watching them with cautious eyes. James smiled at her, hoping to ease her nerves. "Emily, why don't you come sit with us?" She hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked over, sitting down beside James on the couch. Mr. Harrington gave her a kind smile, one that seemed to put her at ease, at least a little. They talked for a while, the conversation mostly light, touching on old memories and shared experiences. James was careful not to reveal too much, but he also found himself appreciating the familiar presence of someone who had known him before his life had changed so drastically. When it was time for Mr. Harrington to leave, he stood at the door, turning to James with a thoughtful expression. "You've come a long way, James," he said quietly, "and I can see that you're doing something important here. Don't lose sight of that." James nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle over him. "I won't," he promised. As Mr. Harrington left, James closed the door and turned back to Emily, who was watching him with a curious expression. "Is he your friend?" she asked, her voice tentative. James thought about the question for a moment before nodding. "Yes," he said softly. "In a way, he is. He's someone who's known me for a long time, and he cares about us." Emily seemed to consider this, then nodded as if accepting it. "Are we going to see him again?" "Maybe," James replied, not wanting to make any promises he couldn't keep. "But only if you want to." Emily smiled a little at that, seeming satisfied with the answer. "Okay," she said simply. As they went about the rest of their day, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The visit from Mr. Harrington had stirred up memories and emotions he hadn't expected to confront, but it had also reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey. He had people who cared, who wanted to help, and maybe it was time to start letting them in. That night, as he tucked Emily into bed and read her a story, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew that they were moving forward, step by step, and that they had the strength to face whatever challenges came their way. As he closed the book and turned off the light, Emily looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Good night, Mr. James," she murmured, her voice filled with trust and warmth. "Good night, Emily," James replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Sweet dreams." And as he left her room and closed the door behind him, James felt a deep sense of peace. The world outside might be full of uncertainties, but within these walls, he and Emily were building something strong, something lasting. And with that thought, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The days following Mr. Harrington's visit passed quietly, but the conversation they had lingered in James's mind. He found himself replaying the words, the offer of help, and the weight of the responsibility he carried. Emily, sensing the change in him, remained close, watching him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to understand more than she let on. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, James sat alone in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a deep frown etched into his features. The house was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He had spent the day mulling over Mr. Harrington's words, grappling with the idea of letting someone else into the carefully constructed world he had built for Emily and himself. He stared at the glass in his hand, watching the amber liquid swirl as his thoughts churned. He knew he had done his best for Emily, that he had given her a stable home and the love she desperately needed. But he also knew that there were limits to what he could do alone. She was a child who had lost everything, and no matter how much he cared for her, he couldn't replace her mother or the life she had known. James's thoughts drifted to the future, Emily's future. She was growing up, and there would be challenges ahead that he couldn't foresee, struggles she would face as she continued to process her grief and adapt to her new life. He couldn't help but wonder if he was enough, if he could truly provide her with everything she needed to heal and thrive. The thought nagged at him, and he found himself reaching for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Mr. Harrington's number. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. Was he really ready to open up, To ask for help after all this time? Just as he was about to put the phone down, a soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep and her teddy bear clutched in her arms. "Emily," he said, surprised. "What are you doing up, sweetheart? It's late." Emily shuffled into the room, her eyes wide with worry. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted quietly, her voice small in the large, dimly lit room. "I had a bad dream." James immediately set down his glass and stood, his concern for her eclipsing his own thoughts. "Come here," he said gently, opening his arms. Emily crossed the room and climbed into his lap, curling up against him as he wrapped his arms around her. She rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing still a little shaky from the remnants of the dream that had disturbed her sleep. "Do you want to talk about it?" James asked softly, rubbing her back in slow, soothing circles. Emily shook her head, snuggling closer. "No, I just want to stay here with you." James's heart tightened at her words, and he held her a little tighter. "You're safe, Emily," he murmured, his voice full of quiet reassurance. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." They sat together in the dim light of the study, the warmth of their shared connection filling the space around them. As James held her, he felt a deep sense of protectiveness, but also a growing realization that perhaps it was time to let go of some of the burdens he had been carrying alone. "Emily," he began carefully, "I want to ask you something." Emily lifted her head slightly, looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. "What is it?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words with care. "You know how much I care about you, right? How much I want to make sure you're happy and safe." Emily nodded, her gaze steady on his. "I know." James hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I've been thinking that maybe it would be a good idea to let some other people into our lives. People who could help us, who could make things easier for you. And for me." Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. "Like who?" "Like Mr. Harrington," James said softly, watching her reaction closely. "He's someone who cares about us, and he might be able to help in ways that I can't." Emily was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You mean like having more friends?" James smiled at her simple, yet insightful, interpretation. "Yes, something like that. People who could be there for us, who can make our lives better." Emily considered this, her small fingers playing with the fabric of his shirt. "Would that mean we'd have to move? Or change things?" James shook his head. "No, we wouldn't have to move. It just means that we'd have more people to rely on, more people who could help us when we need it." Emily's eyes searched his, and James could see the wheels turning in her mind. "Would it make you happy?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. James was touched by her question, the way she always seemed to think of him even when she was the one who had lost the most. "It would make me happy to know that you're surrounded by people who care about you, who want to see you happy," he said honestly. Emily seemed to think about this for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said quietly. "If it's what you think is best, then okay." James felt a surge of relief and affection for the brave, thoughtful girl in his arms. He kissed the top of her head, grateful for her trust. "Thank you, Emily," he murmured. "We're going to be okay, I promise." They sat together for a while longer, the silence between them comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. James felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for weeks. He knew now that he couldn't do it all on his own, that he needed to let others in if they were going to build the life he wanted for Emily. The next morning, James made the call. Mr. Harrington answered on the second ring, his voice warm and expectant. "James," he greeted, a note of surprise in his tone. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." James smiled, feeling a strange sense of peace as he spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "and I think you might be right. Emily and we could use some help." Mr. Harrington's voice softened with understanding. "I'm glad to hear that, James. Whatever you need, I'm here." They spoke for a while, discussing the next steps, how Mr. Harrington could help support them as they moved forward. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders as they talked, the burden of trying to do everything alone beginning to ease. When he hung up the phone, James felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He knew that this was the right decision, not just for him, but for Emily. They were stronger together, and by letting others in, They were building a future that was full of possibility, full of hope. Later that day, as they walked through the garden, James told Emily about the conversation. She listened carefully, her small hand in his. And when he finished, she looked up at him with a smile. "I think Mommy would be happy," she said softly, her voice full of quiet conviction. "She would want us to be happy." James felt a lump in his throat, but he nodded, his heart full. "I think you're right, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she would." They stood together in the garden, the roses blooming brightly around them, and James knew that they were on the right path. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was filled with the promise of new beginnings, of new connections, and of a life that was richer and fuller than he had ever imagined. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, James felt a deep sense of peace. He had made a decision that would change their lives, but it was a decision rooted in love, in hope, and in the belief that they were not alone. And with that, he knew that